The morning I found out, I had been planning to stop at Tim Hortons on the way home. That's the detail that stays with me. I'd been thinking about a double-double and a maple dip, and whether I should get one for my daughter too, the one who lived 20 minutes away, and sometimes dropped by on Thursday afternoons. I was standing at the counter of my branch on Dunbar Street in Vancouver, asking for $400 to pay my contractor cash. He'd done the back deck and preferred it that way. Always had. And the teller, a young woman with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses she'd pushed up on her forehead, looked at my account and went very still. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Calloway," she said quietly, leaning forward just slightly, the way people do when they don't want the person behind you in line to hear. "Could you come with me to speak with our branch manager? There's something we'd like to go over with you." I remember thinking I must have overdrafted somehow, that maybe I'd forgotten a pre-authorized payment. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 32 years as a high school history teacher in the Vancouver school district. I am not a man who panics easily. I raised 2 daughters on my own after my wife Miriam passed from ovarian cancer in 2011. I balanced the books, I kept the house, I made sure both girls got through university without debt. I am methodical, I do not overdraft. But I followed her to the back. The branch manager's name was David. He shook my hand and asked me to sit down, and he turned his monitor toward me, and that was when I saw it. My account balance was $4,211. It should have been $163,000. I remember the feeling. It wasn't panic, not at first. It was more like when you reach for a step that isn't there, that split second of absolute wrongness before your body understands what your mind already knows. I sat there staring at the number, and I said out loud, "That can't be right." David said it was right. He said there had been a series of withdrawals over the past 14 months. Transfers, mostly. Some cash withdrawals at branches in Burnaby and Coquitlam. All of them authorized. All of them made by someone whose name was on the account as a co-account holder. My older daughter, Suzanne. I had added Suzanne to my account 4 years ago, after Miriam died. She was 32 at the time, a paralegal in New Westminster, organized and sharp, the kind of person who reads the fine print. My younger daughter, Faye, lived out in Kelowna, 3 hours away by car and more in winter. She was a kindergarten teacher there, happy, a bit scattered, always late for everything. When I had my hip surgery in 2019 and needed someone local to handle things while I was recovering, it was Suzanne who came. She took 2 weeks off work, managed the prescriptions, drove me to physio, handled the bills. It made sense to add her to the account. It made sense in the way that only feels obvious until it doesn't. I sat in that office for an hour and 40 minutes. David pulled up 14 months of transaction history and walked me through it line by line. There were 43 transfers. Some were small, $800 here, $1,000 there. Several were large. A transfer of $12,000 in March. Another of $9,000 in August. The cash withdrawals were smaller, but they added up. $159,000 total, give or take. I kept looking for my own withdrawals in the list. My mortgage payments, my groceries, my gas, my hydro bill. They were there. Small and regular and honest. And between them, like water draining out of a tub you hadn't noticed had a leak. Everything else had gone. "Did you authorize these?" David asked me. I told him I hadn't. I told him I hadn't even known they were happening. I do most of my banking online, but I check my balance the way I check the weather. I see the number, and as long as it seems normal, I move on. The account had enough in it every time I looked, or close enough that I didn't question it. I hadn't sat down and done a proper accounting since the previous Christmas. 14 months. I drove home in a way I can't fully account for. I remember being on the Granville Bridge and thinking, very clearly, that I needed to call Faye before I called anyone else. Not because Faye would know what to do. Faye cries when she sees injured birds on the road, but because I could not call Suzanne yet. I was not ready to say the words to Suzanne yet, and Faye was safe. Faye had never once borrowed money from me without asking. Faye called me every Sunday at 7 in the evening, even when she was tired, even in the winter, when the drive from Kelowna to see me meant chains on the tires. Faye picked up on the second ring. I told her what the bank had shown me. I heard her go quiet in the same way I'd gone quiet in David's office. Then I heard her crying and I said, I'm fine, I'm trying to think," and she said, "Dad, how long has this been going on?" 14 months. What I didn't tell Faye right away, what I hadn't quite assembled into a sentence yet, was the thing that made it worse. Made it something other than a financial crime committed by my own child. Made it something that turned my stomach in a way that had nothing to do with money. 3 weeks before I walked into that bank, I had made a decision that had been eating at me ever since. I had changed my will. Not dramatically, not disinheriting anyone, but I had reduced Faye's share and increased Suzanne's, because my lawyer had suggested I consider it, and because Suzanne had told me, had said to me, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, in October, that Faye had borrowed $3,000 from her the previous year and hadn't paid it back. She said she didn't want to make it awkward. She said she wasn't asking me to do anything. She just thought I should know. I had believed her. I had sat across from my younger daughter at Christmas, watching her laugh and eat and pour herself a second glass of wine, and I had thought, she borrowed money from her sister and didn't tell me, and I had felt, quietly and secretly, a kind of disappointment I was ashamed of. Faye, who I thought I knew completely. The will had been signed 3 weeks before I went to that bank. That night, I sat at my kitchen table until 1 in the morning with a yellow notepad, and I started writing down everything I could remember. Every time Suzanne had mentioned Faye and money. Every time she had said something slightly off. The kind of remark that you wave away in the moment, because the person saying it is someone you trust. She'd mentioned twice that Faye seemed to be spending a lot. She'd said once, after a phone call I hadn't been on, that Faye had asked about the value of the house. That one had bothered me at the time, and I hadn't let myself sit with it. I called my lawyer the next morning. Her name is Patricia. She's been my family's lawyer since before Miriam died, and I told her to put a hold on everything, not to file the new will yet. I needed time. Then I called the bank and asked to speak to David again. Here's what I did not know about Canadian banking law that I learned in the next 2 weeks. When you add someone to a bank account as a co-account holder, they have equal legal access to the funds. The bank is not obligated to contact the primary account holder before a co-holder makes a withdrawal. The money Suzanne had taken was technically hers to take, not ethically, not morally, but technically. The word technically became the thing I was most tired of hearing. However, and David said this to me carefully, as if he wasn't sure I was ready for more information. However, certain protections still applied. If I could demonstrate that the funds had a specific source that predated Suzanne's addition to the account, and that she had used them in ways that constituted fraud or misrepresentation, I had options. It wasn't nothing. It was not as clean as I wanted, but it was not nothing. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Greta. She was referred to me by Patricia, and she was the most precise person I had ever sat in a room with, the kind of precise that accountants and surgeons have, where you can feel them measuring every word before they let it out. She went through 14 months of transactions with me, over 3 sessions. She cross-referenced the transfer dates with Suzanne's personal spending, which she was able to trace through documentation I provided, and she found a pattern. The $12,000 in March corresponded with a down payment Suzanne and her husband made on a vacation property in the Okanagan. $9,000 in August paid off her husband's truck. Other amounts, smaller ones, were harder to trace, but the large transfers had purposes, and those purposes were not my purposes. Greta said to me, at the end of our 3rd session, "Mr. Calloway, I want to be clear. What I can tell you is where the money went. Whether it went with your knowledge or consent is something only you can speak to. But the pattern of transfers does not look like account management. It looks like extraction." Extraction. That was the word she used. I wrote it on my notepad and stared at it for a while after she left. I want to tell you something about Suzanne because she is not a cartoon villain, and I think that matters. She was a good child. I'm not saying that to soften what she did. I'm saying it because it's true and it makes the whole thing harder to look at directly. She got honor roll in grade 11. She was the one who organized Miriam's memorial service, wrote the program, called the relatives, made sure there were enough chairs. When I had my surgery, she slept on my couch for 12 days, and she did not complain once. She is the person I would have called in an emergency. Before all of this, I would have called her before I called anyone. I think that was part of how it worked. I don't know when it started. I've tried to think back, tried to find the moment when she looked at the access she had to my account and made a decision, and I can't find it. It may not have been a decision exactly. It may have been smaller than that. A transfer that she told herself she'd pay back. Then another. Then a point where the amount was so large that paying it back became impossible, and so the only move left was forward. I understand that. I don't forgive it, but I understand it. What I cannot understand, what I still cannot find a place for, is the story about Faye. Faye had not borrowed money from Suzanne. I know this now with complete certainty, because when I finally sat down with Faye and told her what I'd found, she looked at me with an expression I will not forget and said very quietly, "Suzanne told you that?" She didn't yell. She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat with it. And then she said, "I haven't asked Suzanne for money in my life, Dad. Not once." I believed her. Not because she is my daughter and I wanted to believe her. I believed her because she had no reason to lie. The lie had already been told on her behalf, to her detriment, and she hadn't known about it. She hadn't been defending herself all this time, because she hadn't known there was anything to defend against. I had spent 3 months looking at my younger daughter with a quiet suspicion she knew nothing about. She'd called me every Sunday. She'd driven in February through a winter storm with chains on the tires because she thought I sounded tired on the phone. She'd done all of that while I was sitting on a changed will that cut her out of what was rightfully hers. I called Patricia that night and I told her to revert the will to the previous version. She didn't ask me why. Patricia is a good lawyer. The confrontation with Suzanne was not what I'd expected. I had imagined it several times in the weeks before it happened. Imagined raised voices, or tears, or denial so aggressive it felt like an attack. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways worse. She arrived at the house on a Sunday afternoon, and I had my notepad on the table, and the summary Greta had prepared, and I told her to sit down. She sat down, she looked at the papers, and then she looked at me, and I could see her calculating. Could see her deciding, in real time, how much to give up and how much to hold back. I watched my daughter do math with the truth. She admitted to the transfers. She said she had intended to pay it back. She said she and her husband were going through a difficult period financially. The vacation property had been a mistake. She could see that now, and she had genuinely thought, that she could replace the money before I noticed. She said she was sorry. She said it several times. I asked her about the story she had told me about Faye. The silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever sat through in my own kitchen. Finally, she said, "I was scared you'd look more closely at the account." I didn't respond to that. I let it sit in the room with us. What followed was months I don't fully want to describe. There were lawyers. There were conversations with the bank's fraud department. Because even though the law around joint accounts is complicated, the misrepresentation involved in the story about Faye was a different matter, and my lawyer believed we had grounds to pursue. Suzanne's husband called me once, angry, and I let him talk until he ran out of things to say, and then I said, "I'll have my lawyer contact yours," and I hung up. Suzanne paid back what she could. It was not everything. The Okanagan property sold at a loss. Between what was recovered and what the bank's resolution process addressed, David had flagged several of the transactions for further review, and the bank did take responsibility for the ones that should have triggered a contact protocol. I recovered most of it, not all of it, enough. The will is back to what it was before October. Faye doesn't know that it changed. I haven't told her, and I don't intend to. That is a weight I have decided to carry myself. What I have told her is that I'm sorry. I didn't give her details. Didn't explain that I'd spent 3 months half believing a lie about her, because I didn't want her to carry that. I just told her I was sorry for some distance she might have felt, and she told me she hadn't really noticed, which was either true or the kindest lie I've ever been given, and either way I was grateful for it. She called me last Sunday at 7 in the evening, as she always does. We talked about her students, about a little boy in her class who had just lost his first tooth and cried about it because he hadn't expected it to feel that way. We talked about whether I was going to bother with the garden this year. I've let it go a bit since Miriam, the back garden especially, and she said she'd come in May and help me get the beds ready if I wanted company. I said I'd like that very much. I have not spoken to Suzanne since January. I don't know if that will change. I am 61 years old and I am tired in a way I wasn't tired before. But I am not broken, which is more than I expected to be able to say when I was sitting in David's office, staring at a number that shouldn't have existed. The contractor finished the deck, by the way. I paid him an e-transfer in the end. He sent me a photo when it was done. Cedar planks, clean lines, faces out over the backyard toward the Douglas fir at the back of the property. Miriam always wanted a proper deck. She used to say we'd drink our morning coffee out there when we retired. I drank my coffee out there this morning. It was cold still, That thin April cold that makes you think spring is coming, without quite committing to it yet. The fur was just starting to come back, that pale new green at the tips of the branches. Some things you build for people who are gone, you build them anyway. The child who shows up quietly, who drives through February snowstorms and calls every Sunday and asks for nothing. That child rarely gets the credit they're owed, until the moment you realize they were the only one who was never taking anything away.